A Thing in the Woods. Chapter 16. Morning came and the tapping stopped. My room fell silent, but I remained under my sheet. I listened to the sound of my own breath, taking comfort in it because I knew what that sound was, and it meant that I was alive. It was the only sound, but the memory of the voices in my room was still so fresh that I could almost hear them with each exhale. I was cold and shivering. My muscles were aching because I'd been afraid to move into a more comfortable position for hours. I was awake, but I wasn't fully there. Some part of me had shut down during the night, and now it was like I was observing myself from somewhere down a long hallway. My door opened, and I heard my mother's voice say, "Time to get up." I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I was scared that if they knew that I was awake, they would do something to me. I didn't even realize that it was my mother speaking at first. "Hey," she said. This time she pulled the sheet off of me. I jumped, suddenly coming back to full alertness. When my mother saw this, she stepped back and said, "Whoa, I didn't mean to startle you. Are you okay?" I blinked a few times and looked around the room. I half expected to see a stranger standing in the corner, but there was only my mother. Looking up at her, I blinked again. For the briefest of moments, I considered rushing to her and hugging her and telling her that I was scared. Then I remembered hearing her say that I would need to get help, and I held back. "I'm fine," I told her, and then yawned. I was exhausted. I remember feeling as though my entire body were vibrating, and I wasn't even sure that I'd be able to stand up. My mother smiled at me and told me that it was going to be a good day. Then she told me to make my bed and get downstairs for breakfast. I don't remember whether or not I replied to her. I just remember watching her walk out of my room, and I closed the door behind her. I went to my dresser and grabbed a pair of socks and put them on. The idea of being barefoot made me nauseous. Then I paced across my floor a few times, trying to wake myself up so that I could think clearly. I wanted help. I needed to make people believe me. At first, I didn't remember the recorder on the nightstand. When the thought of it came to me at last, I walked toward the thing as though it might attack me. If my plan had worked, then there should be hours of material. My parents would be able to hear the whispers. They would believe me. They would help me. I wouldn't be alone. Everything I needed could be sitting right there on my nightstand, and yet I hesitated to pick it up. I wanted to hold on to the possibility of hope for as long as possible, because without it, I had nothing. After that moment of hesitation, I pushed aside the books and papers that had been covering the recorder, and I picked it up. I opened it and looked at the tape, and my heart nearly burst when I saw that the entire tape was full. The recorder had been set to only record when there was a sound to trigger it. If there was no sound, the tape would be empty. The fact that it had filled the whole tape meant that evidence had to be there. I rewound the tape, wishing that I had a digital recorder as I waited and waited for it to get back to the beginning. Then I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and pressed play. There was a steady hiss on the tape, which was normal for any recording. I tried to ignore that hiss and listen closely for the sound of the whispers. I knew that they might be hard to hear, but if the recorder had recorded, that meant that it had to have picked up the sound of the voices. Nothing else would have triggered it. The hiss continued, and I waited. I stood there with the recorder to my ear for minutes, knowing that the voices had to have been there because I had heard them. They had to be there. And yet, they weren't. I had done everything right. I had set up the recorder properly, and it had worked properly, and the voices should have been there. And I couldn't understand why they weren't. I fast-forwarded the tape and then played it. I thought that maybe the voices had gotten louder as time went on, but still there was nothing. I fast-forwarded again and again and again. Nothing. So I stopped the tape. I put the recorder down. I walked out of my bedroom and into the bathroom. I turned on the water and stared at my own tired eyes in the mirror, holding my breath so that I wouldn't cry. If I cried, my parents would know. They would have me taken away. I would be locked up and medicated. There might even be electric shock treatment. The sound of the water was steady and calming, It was loud enough so that I wouldn't have been able to hear a whisper or a laugh, even if they were there. Still listening to the sound of the water, I stiffened myself up and told myself, I'm okay. Then I pulled myself together and went downstairs. When I got downstairs, my parents were sitting at the kitchen table with their breakfast in front of them. My father was already staring at his laptop as he ate, which was unusual for him, but nothing surprised me at that point. I got myself some breakfast and walked to the table, sitting down and keeping quiet as I ate. As my mother finished with her breakfast, she walked her dishes to the sink and then walked behind me. She took my head in her hands and tilted my head back so that she could look me in the eyes. Are you feeling okay? She asked me. I nodded, despite the fact that she was still holding my head in her hands. I told her that I was tired. I made up an excuse about being restless all night because I hadn't been able to burn off any energy lately. My parents always talked about burning off my energy, so I was using their own lingo on them. How could they possibly deny the legitimacy of my story when I was basing it on their own words? Seeing my opportunity to expand upon this comment, I told her that I needed to get out and run around more. Then I asked if I could track down my friends and play with them for a while. She came back with the same old response, "We'll see." Then she playfully slapped me on the cheeks, and I went back to eating my breakfast. My father was far more quiet than normal that morning. It was something that I couldn't help but notice as I watched him tap and click away on his laptop. As I ate, my mother was making small talk, trying her best to make everything feel normal, though we all knew that nothing was normal. I don't remember what she was talking about, but I remember the way she would make a joke and then look at me to make sure that I was reacting appropriately. Even at the best of times, my parents' jokes weren't worthy of many belly laughs, and I felt even less inclined to respond with one while she was evaluating me like that. But I smiled and did my best. After everyone was done eating, my mother told my father that he should be heading out or he would be late for work. My father looked up from his laptop and told her, I called in sick. I always looked at sick days like they were super special vacation days. Sometimes my parents would let me stay home from school when I wasn't sick, just because they thought that I could use a day off. It was always exciting and fun, like we were in on some sort of heist together. I expected my mother to react that way when my father took the day off, but she didn't. She seemed almost angry with him, and I wasn't sure why. My father ignored her reaction and looked at me as he said, I was thinking of going to the library today. You should come. It'll do you some good to get out of the house for a while. Then he looked at my mother and said, both of you. My mother replied by telling him that she already had her day planned and she couldn't just drop everything at the last minute. So my father looked at me and said, just us guys then. He said it as though this were a big deal. My father always enjoyed going to the library way too much. He acted as though it were the same as going to the movies or a theme park. I liked the library, but I was always much less excited about it than he was. I went along with the excitement anyway this time, because I needed that time away from home. I needed to see that the rest of the world was still out there. I went back to my room to get dressed and ready to head out. From the moment I walked into my bedroom, it felt different than it had the night before. It felt like it really was my room, as opposed to an exhibit in the intruder's Museum of Horrors. I wanted to lie down and go to sleep. I wanted to believe that I could still sleep during the day and finally get some rest. But as soon as that thought occurred to me, I realized that my blanket was missing. When I woke up in the middle of the night, the blanket wasn't on my bed anymore. I knew that much, but I hadn't taken the time to look for the blanket that morning. Now I was looking, and I couldn't find it anywhere. It wasn't on the chair or in my closet. It wasn't under my bed. I even went to the window and looked outside, thinking that the intruders might have thrown it out the window, but it wasn't there either. My blanket was just gone. This left me speechless for a few seconds, wondering where my blanket could be. Things didn't just disappear into thin air, so it had to be somewhere. And I wanted to find it. It was mine. But there wasn't enough time. If I didn't go downstairs and leave with my father, he would come upstairs looking for me. If he found me on my hands and knees crawling under my bed in search of a disappearing blanket, I had no idea how he would react. I couldn't forget that the intruders weren't my only problem. I was still alone in this, and I still needed to put on an act in front of my parents. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, the way my second-grade teacher, Mrs. Dougal, had taught my class to do when we started to get overwhelmed or emotional. I pushed aside my need to find the blanket and focused on the task at hand, which was to be normal. I checked my clothes to make sure that I hadn't put anything on backwards or inside out, and then I headed toward the stairs. The sound of my parents' whisper fighting once again stopped me. "I told you that we needed to get back to normal," my mother said. "And I said that we needed to figure out what the hell is going on around here," my father replied. "What's going on is that we have an exhausted, traumatized little boy who is trying to process something horrible that happened to him." "You heard what Lucy said," my father cut in. "This isn't normal." My mother almost laughed and said, "Nothing about this is normal." "You didn't see the look in his eyes the other night. He was terrified. I just want to know why." "I'm terrified. If we don't help him get past this, he could be broken for life. We should find a doctor, not whatever nonsense you're reading." They went on like this for a few minutes, unaware that I was listening to them from the top of the stairs. They spoke about me as though I were the subject of an experiment rather than their own son. They talked about me and argued about me and made plans in regards to me, but neither one of them stopped to think that maybe they should just talk to me. After all, what could I possibly know about what I was going through? I was just a stupid kid, and a problem to be solved. I did wonder what Lucy had said to them about what she'd experienced. I watched her speak to my father, but I couldn't make out what she said. Had she tried to explain it all to them? Had she tried to tell them that I wasn't crazy? There was no way of knowing. My parents weren't going to tell me what Lucy had said, that was for sure. After my parents stopped arguing with each other, I waited another minute or two, and then went downstairs, acting normal. My mother didn't say anything as my father and I left the house, got into the car, and drove toward town. I used to wonder if she just went back to her normal work after that, or if she stopped to research psychiatric hospitals and all of the drugs that could be given to lunatic children. Now, looking back, I'm not sure that I would blame her. The car ride with my father was mostly silent. He tried to fill the void by turning on the radio, but even with classic rock playing in the background, the silence was heavy. I stared out the window as we went, trying to isolate myself. Normally, I would have been rambling on about 100 random and silly topics, and my father would pretend to be interested. He would play along with whatever game I made up along the way, and he would make bad jokes that I would find hilarious. Now, there was just the emptiness between us, and I was haunted by the people that we used to be. I missed my parents, and I didn't know how to feel the way I felt about them. I loved them and missed them and feared them and distrusted them all at the same time. When I look back on that time in my life, that's the part that I hate the most. My world broke. Even after it healed, it left an ugly scar. The library in Huxley was an old building, which I've always imagined as a bank at some point in the distant past. It was made of brick with dark wood floors inside. There were 2 floors in the library, with the children's section being on the bottom floor and the grown-up books upstairs. Though I'd ventured up the stairs a few times and had been allowed to choose books under the watchful eye of my parents, I was still relegated to the downstairs area most of the time. This was fine with me since the comic books were downstairs. When my father and I walked into the library that day, my father stopped just inside the entrance. He stopped for a moment as though coming up with a game plan, and then turned to me. He told me to stay downstairs as usual and to stay out of trouble. I nodded my agreement and we split up, each going our own way. For the first time in days, I felt a small amount of freedom. I had the opportunity to do something proactive, but I didn't know what that meant in my situation. I didn't know whether I should run to the police for help or run away altogether. Either one of those options would have probably resulted in me being dragged back home, giving my parents even more reason to think that I was crazy. I wasn't crazy, though. I knew that I wasn't, but standing in a normal place, doing normal things, out in the world, made everything I'd been going through seem just a little bit crazy. It's always easier for me to spiral when I'm alone. After my father went upstairs, I walked up and down the aisles of books, separated into age groups and then into various sections based on topic. I went to the section for older kids and tried to find something that might help me understand what I was going through. There were books on myths and urban legends, books about monsters and aliens, ghosts and vampires. I looked through those books trying to find answers, but everything was watered down and sanitized for its target demographic. Many of the stories had elements that made them seem like they were on the right path for my research, but nothing that was exactly like what I'd been experiencing. It was only the wrongness of those stories that I was drawn to. There was a picture in one of the books that caught my eye. I think the book was about alien abductions, so there was no useful information in it, but the picture made me pause anyway. The picture was of a dark figure, standing over the bed of a sleeping person. I froze when I saw it, and I think that I might have even stopped breathing. For as long as I was staring at that picture, I was back in my room, alone in the dark, scared and shaking. There was a tap on my shoulder, very real and not part of any memory. When I felt it, it was like a black fog drifted in front of my eyes. I fell to the ground and put one arm over my face to protect me from whatever was there. It happened so fast that there was no thought involved. My reaction was just reflex at that point. I had come to expect terror, and my reaction to it was to close my eyes and hide my face. "Whoa, dude, relax. It's just me," Mike said to me. His eyes were wide and his mouth was stuck somewhere between a grin and a wince. When he saw the fear in my eyes, he repeated his last sentence. "It's just me." Rather than extend a hand and help me get back up, Mike sat down on the ground with me. In an empty aisle of the library, we were alone. Even if my father came looking, it would take him a while to find me. I took a deep breath, and it felt like the first breath I'd taken in days. After sitting in silence for a few seconds, just allowing me to catch my breath, Mike spoke again. I remember his exact words. "What the hell?" So I explained it to him. I started with finding the body and then told him everything that followed. The sleepless nights, the whispers and laughs and tapping on my foot. I said it all out loud for the first time, and I started to see why my parents would think that I was insane. It sounded insane. I felt insane. But, pursuant to Childhood Friend Code Article 7, Section 3, Paragraph 4, Mike believed every crazy word without hesitation. He believed me. There wasn't a lot that he could do about it at the moment, but it was enough just to be heard and believed. It made me feel like a person again. Mike told me that he would tell the others about the situation. They would get on the case and help me figure it out. Maybe they could beg their parents for a sleepover so I wouldn't have to go through it alone anymore, assuming that any of our parents could get past the potential of a serial killer walking amongst us. We smiled as we made that morbid joke about the possible killer. There were still 2 dead bodies. Kids. According to Mike, he and Alex had gone down to the woods to check out the investigation. They'd only been able to get down there once, the day before I ran into them at the library. They were hoping to see guys in cool body armor with big guns and police dogs. What they saw instead was an empty field. The police were gone. I asked him, did they find anything? All I got in response was a shrug. I could picture the empty field clearly in my head. I'd been there so many times I could probably walk there with my eyes closed. I could picture the area where the empty field led into the trees, and the trees led down to the river. I could picture the mud, slimy, dirty, chunky mud oozing between my bare toes. That place had always been my refuge. It was the place where my childhood happened, and where I could always go when I needed to find a moment of peace in the chaos of life. As Mike and I sat there and talked, it became clear that the woods were something different to both of us now. It was the place where dead children were buried. It was the place where nightmares began. The conversation was dark, to say the least, but I was no longer on my own. My friends would be working to figure this out with me. They would try to get to my house and stand with me against the intruders. It wasn't actually a plan, but it felt enough like one. My friends were still my friends. My life still existed on the other side of this. By the time I left the library that day, I felt relieved. I felt hopeful. That hope was fleeting.
This is the voice of the Embers, where stories burn and fade.